There was a time, not so long ago, when Jewish and Black Americans stood in solidarity together against the establishment in what was referred to as the Grand Alliance. Since then, the relationship between Jewish and Black Americans has disintegrated. And it's clear, the only way to heal this divide is to do a podcast. Oh, no, it's not. Come on. I mean, who better to explain the plight of historically marginalized religious and cultural groups than a Protestant-turned-agnostic white guy? Literally anyone. Come on, where's your spirit of adventure? Consider me a passionately dispassionate third-party observer.
UNFTR. Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us.
Universities, the torch-wielding white nationalists coming face-to-face.
A demonstration by white nationalists at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville.
White lives matter. White lives matter. White lives matter.
There's a saying in journalism, don't bury the lead, meaning say what you mean up front and then go about supporting it. You don't want your point to get lost. Well, that clip that you just saw, that's the lead. The chants in Charlottesville moved seamlessly between Jews will not replace us and white lives matter. That's the subtext that's missing from the conversation today. In any conflict, it's important to ask who stands to gain the most from it. And in this case, it seems perfectly clear. So let's go back to when the supposed Grand Alliance was at its zenith during the Civil Rights era. There are two iconic moments from the 1960s that many came to define as examples of the Black and Jewish solidarity in the United States. One is a photo of Dr. Martin Luther King in the march from Selma to Montgomery, walking arm in arm with white and black leaders, including Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a prominent progressive figure in Jewish American history. The other is the murder of Southern Black activist James Chaney and Jewish activists from New York, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, in 1964. Their disappearance galvanized the nation, and the subsequent uncovering of the bodies and conspiracy to murder the men would be memorialized in the film Mississippi Burning. Many Black and Jewish intellectuals have downplayed the significance of these moments in terms of their defining nature. It's felt by many that Jewish leaders romanticize these events while Black leaders tend to downplay them. And in either case, it's most certainly reductive, but that's the nature of whitewashed history. Even if the truth lives comfortably in the middle, I think it's fair to say that relations have most certainly gone downhill since this time. The alliance in the 1960s was quite natural, and it was forged out of necessity and like-mindedness on several issues. And those issues were equality, justice, racism, and the war in Vietnam. At this time, the interests of Black and Jewish Americans were fairly aligned in socioeconomic and class terms. Jews from various backgrounds and nations had been migrating to the United States since the 1600s. The next 4 centuries would be punctuated by waves of Jewish immigrants coming to America for both economic opportunity and sanctuary. The largest wave was of Ashkenazi Jews, meaning Jews of Eastern European descent, after World War I. Jewish immigrants followed a similar trajectory to most new Americans. In other words, they weren't exactly received with open arms. Jewish people in the United States would be met with the same suspicion as most groups and often sought refuge among their own people and culture in the ever-expanding urban centers of America, with one key distinction. Jews were met with a double dose of anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiments that would suppress their ability to economically assimilate, as many other predominantly white cultures would do within a generation. This is a crucial element of the story. Black Americans, of course, had no origin story of their own when it came to willful migration. They were compelled by force and brutality on the Middle Passage to America. Generation after generation, from bondage through supposed freedom, Black Americans would remain shackled, literally at first, and then figuratively through disenfranchisement, segregation, and incarceration. As generation after generation of white immigrants to America moved from poverty to prosperity, Black Americans were halted at every turn. By the way, we litigated this economic argument in the Economics of Racism episode that we did pretty recently, so I'll leave a link to that below, and I encourage you to check that out. Today, Jewish Americans enjoy a higher standard of living relative to other identity groups. Now, that's not to say that there are not Jews who live in poverty, but on balance, Jewish household income is among the highest of peer groups of race and religion. But this wasn't the case for most of the Jewish experience in the United States. In fact, Jewish immigrants worked in horrific conditions and were relegated to the low end of brutal trades like the garment industry. Over time, they found work in other service areas of the economy, such as healthcare, education, and the entertainment industry. This isn't a reinforcement of stereotypes, as these are the industries in which Jewish people are most represented according to Pew Employment Research. Now, we'll explain why in great detail, but that's an important thing to note. These early experiences of trying to forge a path forward in a society that refused to accept them in most visible industries helped foster the modern tropes that we often associate with American Jews: the liberal college professor, the doctor, the entertainment agent, and so on. In many stereotypes, you can always find a kernel of truth, but these stereotypes take on a life of their own and sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy that remains tethered to a group long after that kernel is gone. The other notable characteristic of Jewish immigrants prior to the Second World War was liberalism. Judaism is steeped in justice and equality, both in religious text and in cultural tradition, far more than the other dominant monotheistic religions of the world, mind you. As such, prior to the war, cultural and religious Jews were often sympathetic to socialist and communist causes, traditions that they brought with them from Europe after the First World War. They were also a people without a homeland. There was no rallying cry for Israel because there was no Israel yet. During the period between the two great wars, stories were leaking out about Jews being subjugated and even hunted in Europe. And when American Jews looked out for empathy and support, there was only one group that required no explanation of their plight. In African American communities, Jews found solidarity and commonality. After the war, Jewish and Black people in America continued to find common ground in the 1950s during the communist witch hunts that put government officials, along with several high-profile Jews in entertainment and academia, on trial in both real court and the court of public opinion.
Our nation may well die. Our nation may well die. And I ask you, who caused it? Was it loyal Americans or was it traitors in our government?
So before we get to the turning point in the 1960s, let's examine the overlap of economic experiences between the two communities for a moment. Think of where Jews in this country were relegated or allowed to work and prosper in the 20th century: entertainment, medicine, finance, and academia. Now think about the areas that Black people were allowed to work and prosper: service and entertainment. The most visible grievances in the Black community today where Jews are concerned is in entertainment. When we first understand that this was one of the areas of intersectionality between Jews and Black people in the country, the area of the economy that they were allowed to participate in, we can more easily understand the roots of a fracture in this industry. The stubborn trope that the media and entertainment industries are controlled by Jews has a small kernel of historical truth that we talked about. But if anything, it's the word control we should take issue with.
Talking about the wicked ones in the Jewish community that run America, run the government, run the world, own the banks, own the means of communication. They are my enemies.
Jewish representation in the media and entertainment is a factor of historical legacy. Shunned from most industries, save for the few that we mentioned, Jews carved out a meaningful place in just a handful of businesses. To suggest that Jewish people have control over these industries is laughable and the perpetuation of shameless stereotypes. It's like saying that enslaved Black people had control over the fashion industry because they picked cotton for garments. And yes, I know that's stupid, and I'm sorry if that hits anyone's ears the wrong way. But there's a more direct and logical extension of thought that we'll get to in the next section. But for now, if we carry this one particular line of thinking through to a logical place, then it becomes clear why Black entertainers, who have the most amplified voices in today's culture, still have a bone to pick with Jewish people. For decades in the entertainment industry, Black artists were taken advantage of in stunning ways. And in some cases, it was by Jewish executives. It was commonplace for Black artists to lose rights to their work even when they thought it was protected. Every successful genre of music established by Black artists was appropriated by white artists with little credit and usually no remuneration. So today, when we see prominent Black celebrities like Dave Chappelle, Kyrie Irving, Meek Mill, Ice Cube, or Jay-Z dip into Jewish conspiracy theories, they're tapping into a bifurcated attitude. One is the long-held cliche that Jews have profited from their work. The other is that Jewish people paved the way for how black industry can develop. We like to tell ourselves stories and fables about people and groups who defied the odds. It's what makes stories like Motown so important. But these stories are often sold as the norm rather than the exception to the rule, like claiming that we're in a post-racial period because Barack Obama was president, or economic justice has been achieved in entertainment because Jay-Z's a billionaire. In this way, these stories aren't helpful because they obscure the reality on the ground, and the reality for black artists in America has been and remains historically diminished relative to their white counterparts. All of this is not to suggest that Jewish people as a rule are or were in any way responsible for this phenomenon. Participants to an extent. But we need to eliminate absolutist rhetoric on both sides to move forward with a productive dialogue. Now, with all that being said, let's move into the 1960s, the inflection point in the narrative. The fragile alliance between black and Jewish activists, locked in struggle against economic oppression, political violence, and anti-war protests, reached a peak in the mid-1960s. This is the brief moment in time that's taught to us in school. It's memorialized in federal holidays and days of remembrance. History recalls this as a crescendo to be celebrated, and perhaps it was. But below the surface, there were already splinter movements gaining momentum and advocating more and more radical change and fomenting discord among the ranks of the civil rights movement. For decades, the establishment media and political apparatus have busied themselves crafting a convenient narrative for this era. First, by watering down the more radical activism of somebody like Dr. King, by portraying groups like the Nation of Islam, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Black Panthers as fringe players. Then, by erasing them altogether from official narratives, left as subjects of just documentaries and published works in academia. In reality, these movements were galvanizing young black Americans in significant ways that can still be found today in black art and culture. Even in the late 1960s, as the fragile civil rights alliances began to break down, the rise of these black movements were aided by Jewish intellectuals like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, who promoted the work of black intellectuals like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, and collaborated with rising figures like Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, Fred Hampton, and Elaine Brown. Leaders of the Black Power movement in the United States coincided with the rise of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa and opened Black Americans to the idea of a global Black identity. At the same time, Jews were beginning to realize the profundity and potential of Israel during its defining Six-Day War in 1967. Here's journalist and scholar Ben Ratskoff talking about this period.
In the late 60s, it's a rather overdetermined moment. I mean, there's a lot of things happening at once, right? Which is that, SNCC is expelling all of its white members, right? Losing all of this funding from white Jews at the same time that the 67 war in Israel and Palestine, right, is happening and is shifting kind of this anti-colonial global consciousness, right? At the same time that Black Panthers are like concentrating in Algeria, right? Which is like a site of solidarity with Palestine, right? So it's like this incredibly overdetermined moment of all of these different factors.
Now, domestically, something else was happening in American cities: suburban sprawl. In the 1950s, the federal government worked diligently with state governments and developers to encourage the Great Migration from cities. Now, initially, white Christian veterans were given early and unconstitutional access to these developments. Then came the intervention and proliferation of credit through personal lines and mortgages. Homeownership exploded throughout the 60s and 70s, and for the first time in America, Jewish people were gaining access to the so-called American dream. Black partners in the Grand Alliance didn't fare as well during this period. Redlining was still the official, unofficial policy of real estate and insurance industries. Mortgages were offered at higher rates for black buyers than white buyers. Credit cards were denied to black applicants even after the practice was made illegal by using real estate red lines as a reason for approval or denial. For the first time in modern U.S. history, one of the last economically marginalized groups was making inroads while the other appeared to be backsliding once again. Now, figures like Louis Farrakhan would feed into the economic and political inequality by scapegoating the Jewish people specifically. Not all Jewish people, he would say, just the satanic ones who control the media, education, medicine, and entertainment. They're the reason why you get so little from a record deal. They're the reason why you wait longer to be treated in the hospital, why you can't access higher education, why you're demonized in the corporate media. Like all propaganda lies that are repeated, they take on an air of truth to the listener when that's all they hear. And here's where perspective matters. While leaders like Farrakhan have absolutely had a demonstrable impact on the psyche of some Black Americans, there was the economic and political reality of the post-civil rights era that was evident to all. Jewish people were getting ahead. They were also retaining their culture and rallying behind a distant homeland. And many in the Black community felt as though they had kind of closed the door behind them. To illustrate this way more eloquently and powerfully than I ever could, I want to read a passage from one of James Baldwin's most impactful essays. Now, forgive the anachronistic language, but Baldwin's words are sacrosanct and deserve to be preserved. Quote, "In the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti-Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man, for having become, in effect, a Christian. The Jew profits from his status in America, and he must expect Negroes to distrust him for it. The Jew does not realize that the credential he offers, the fact that he has been despised and slaughtered, does not increase the Negro's understanding. It increases the Negro's rage." So here he is using language that remains difficult for many to hear even to this day. But what he conveys, perhaps more powerfully than anyone ever before, is the sentiment in the Black community that Jewish assimilation was due to whiteness, and that remembering past traumas and maintaining a cultural identity is indeed the right of any group, but that these factors cannot absolve a people of the sin of whiteness in America and integrating with the white Christian systems of power. Jonathan Weisman, author of Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump, writes about the fracture in the alliance in sobering terms. Quote, "For years now, it has been the only question in the Jewish political world. Where do you stand on Israel? The American Jewish obsession with Israel has taken our eyes off not only the politics of our own country, the growing gulf between rich and poor, and the rising tide of nationalism, but also our own grounding in faith." End quote. Weisman is tapping into one of the most important elements of Judaic tradition: justice. Anyone with even the vaguest understanding of Judaism knows that social justice is core to its tenets. Now, one critical note here. I'm referencing the conservative and reformed religious systems and not Orthodox Judaism. I'm less familiar with the practices and interpretations of Judaism in the Orthodox community, though tension between this group and the Black community in urban settings certainly contributed to the divide. So, to be clear, I'm speaking of the secular and more liberal religious interpretations of Judaism as prescribed in modern Jewish culture. So likewise, Weisman is speaking a hard truth about Jewish representation in American political life, and that's the almost single-minded focus on supporting Israel above all else. Having placed the Grand Alliance in some historical context, we have to push ourselves to touch this third rail. One's stance on Israel has become a litmus test in today's society, and it's very much a part of the cleavage between the Black and Jewish communities. It's central to the criticisms of the conspiracy documentary that Kyrie Irving shared a couple of years ago, for example. It's central to the anti-Semitic lyrics that can sometimes be found in hip-hop culture, and central to the divide in the Democratic Party. Of course, this has been a sticking point in the Black power community for years. Non-establishment Black leaders like Touré, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and so on have been aligned with the Palestinian struggle for decades. It's a tradition that's today carried on by leftist leaders like Cornel West, or young leftists inspired by the BDS movement. It was core to the central policy statements of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, Weisman explores this territory further, saying, quote, "For young progressives on campuses across the country, fealty to the BDS movement is just another item to check off as they make their way down the list of liberal causes: Black Lives Matter, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ rights, gender sensitivities, opposition to all manner of cultural appropriation, and intersectionality. Sympathizing with the oppressed is the job of the woke generation. But although Jews have been exiled, isolated, disenfranchised, and massacred since Nebuchadnezzar, we are no more due the sympathies of the left on campus than we are due special treatment in higher education admissions or workplace hiring. To the advocates of BDS, Israel's current military strength and right-wing policies negate 3,000 years of hatred. So this is the hard stuff now. We're up to tricky territory. But this is where I suggest we do not tread lightly. We have to attack these issues head on. We have to take people's perspectives into account to understand where we're all coming from. I mean, I find myself at odds with the left and the right over the where do you stand on Israel's right to exist question, because it's a stupid question. No country has a right to exist. But to deny the Jewish experience through all of history and say that Jewish people do not have the right to a homeland is also kind of ahistorical and ignorant. Domestically, Baldwin is certainly right to chastise Jews in the United States who use Jewish history to absolve them of abandoning issues of justice and equality and for assimilating into patriarchal white power structures, just as Wiseman's right to chastise the left for denying Israel's total right to exist, to the extent that that sentiment exists in certain pockets. One can be both critical of Israel's murderous treatment of Palestinians and understand the need for a Jewish homeland. These truths can live together, but the conversations are difficult. And for many Jews in America, any criticism of Israel's treatment toward Palestinian is an indictment of Judaism. It's not. To call Gaza an open-air prison isn't anti-Semitic. To call Hamas corrupt is not an indictment of the Palestinian people either. The UN Special Rapporteur's condemnation of Israel as an apartheid state is not an act of hate. Human rights organizations calling the massacre of Gazans a genocide isn't anti-Semitic. It's a reflection of reality. But the conditions that support this view are not perpetrated by Jewish people, but the government of Israel. For if it was the former, then the world would have condemned the Belgian people forever for the murder of more than 10 million Congolese, Germans for the murder of 6 million Jews, Americans for the near extermination of native people. This ties into the persistent thread in the Black Power movement regarding the right of Jews to even claim a homeland in the Middle East as some sort of restitution for the Holocaust.
And let me tell you a tactic of Zionism. What they do is that every time you say something, they bring out Hitler. You understand? And they make you feel scared about Hitler. Okay, if Hitler killed as many Jews as he did, then what the Jews should do is take Germany. Why you go to Palestine? The Arabs ain't did nothing to you. Number one.
Wiseman picks up on the modern debate of legitimacy, noting that, quote, American Jews are still loath to see it, but the Israel diversion is proving to be a trap. Zionism, Jewish nationalism, cuts both ways, end quote. In reality, the onus is on all of us to have a better, more rational conversation. It's important for the left to draw attention to injustices in Israel and Palestine, and here at home. In fact, anywhere in the world. The right certainly isn't going to do it. In fact, in the most bizarre of circumstances, Christian fundamentalists have been some of the staunchest supporters of Israel, albeit for pretty terrible reasons. Again, Wiseman. Quote, Christian fundamentalists saw the founding of the Jewish state and the gathering of Jews in the Holy Land as an important step toward the New Testament's prophesied Armageddon and the eventual return of Jesus Christ. The Jews all might die, slaughtered in the battle of the faithful against the faithless, incinerated in the tribulation, or left behind by the rapture. But for now, they were good friends. The alt-right, characterized by Richard Spencer, Nick Fuentes, Gavin McGinnis, maybe some current tech billionaires and others, are less charitable than their evangelical soulmates. They outright deny the Holocaust and demonize Jews in every way imaginable. The vast majority of elected officials that don't fall into these buckets are largely supportive of Israel because of its position as a proxy military and intelligence outpost for the United States. Others are beneficiaries of campaign money from sources like AIPAC. Then there's the black splinter group known as the Black Hebrew Israelites, who have been preaching on street corners in the black community for decades. Much like the Nation of Islam, it's managed to galvanize a small corner of the black community, and it's their words mostly that are echoed in the most visibly disturbing anti-Semitic remarks that have recently bubbled up to the surface.
The Lord had sent Christ, the black Messiah, according to Revelation chapter 1, verse 14 and 15, to die for us. He's a black man. It describes his hair, his skin color. Christians read that and go, no. Although they're reading, his hair was like wool, his feet like it burned in a furnace. They've been preconditioned to hate, despise the way we look. But the message is redemption is coming.
The idea that Christ as a historical figure was indeed a person of color isn't exactly new. The twist by the Black Hebrew Israelites is that Africans are among the true descendants of Jacob and members of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. These tribes were spread throughout Africa and the Middle East and purportedly assimilated and lost to history. The Black Hebrew Israelites believe that they are among the lost tribes, as are Japanese and Native Americans, mind you. Geography be damned. The central tenet of their belief is that Christ will return to earth to enslave and then destroy the white race, which sounds pretty un-Jesus-like to me. That's why I can't go too much further into the history or legitimacy of the Black Hebrew Israelites, fighting over the providence of 10 tribes that may or may not have existed. It's like fighting over whether Joseph Smith found gold tablets bearing the word of God in upstate New York, or if Xenu brought life to planet Earth 75 million years ago in L. Ron Hubbard's space opera. And I'm agnostic, so that probably doesn't help. But more importantly, theocratic discussions tend to weigh down any practical dialogue about the human condition as it is in the here and now. The alchemy of James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Kwame Ture, Cornel West, the unfortunate sprinkling of thoughts from the Black Hebrew Israelites and Louis Farrakhan, have twisted the relationship between Black and Jewish people in America into an unrecognizable and seemingly irreconcilable state, if it's allowed to stand. Jewish leaders who cannot attend to the principal articles of Jewish faith amidst any criticism of its homeland are doing a disservice to the Jewish people. One can stand in support of a Jewish homeland and in fact admire the enduring tenacity of the Jewish people, while criticizing the far-right elements of Israeli society that actively oppress the rights of a people. As Cornel West has said, quote, Marcus Garvey was a Zionist, Du Bois was a Zionist, King was a Zionist. Even Booker T. Washington urged his people to, quote, imitate the Jew. As much as every word I've uttered thus far is that of an outsider, and hopefully an objective observer, let me return to the lead, as I promised, and give you some insider information. As a white man in this country, I can assure you that the most recent fracture in the Grand Alliance is music to the ears of the white patriarchal establishment that propagates and thrives by pitting classes and marginalized people against one another. The state requires this kind of animus between classes of people because the moment the oppressed realizes that the real Grand Alliance in America is and has always been between white men and Christian zealots, the balance of power will shift and alter the course of this nation. It's incumbent upon Jews to reach back and open the door to empower those who have been left behind, to recognize the pillars of their faith are greater than the fealty they pay to the structures of corporate power. Black Americans must resist the temptation to dismiss the Jewish experience in the world and see that the gains amassed by Jews in America are because the white Christian overlords have allowed it as a matter of convenience. It's a tenuous relationship at best that white Christians would sacrifice at the first sign of inconvenience. The path toward healing this divide, to restoring any semblance of the so-called Grand Alliance, begins with the understanding of class struggle. Black Americans are still an economic underclass. Jewish Americans are still considered second-class citizens to the white Christians who tolerate blackness and tolerate Jewishness. But if push comes to shove, in some dystopian way, they would cast them both aside without a second's hesitation. Here endeth the lesson. As always, I welcome your feedback, and if you got something out of the video, please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel. We also have a free weekly newsletter designed, created, curated lovingly for progressives and leftists. So go to UNFTR.com, sign up for our free weekly newsletter today. Two books that I want to reference that I relied on heavily for this episode. The first is Terrence L. Johnson and Jacques Berlinerblau's Blacks and Jews in America, An Invitation to Dialogue. And as you heard, I pulled a lot from Jonathan Weisman, Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. So a couple great resources for you. They're linked in our bookshop. You can also find a link to our bookshop on bookshop.org at UNFTR.com. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next video.